Hello everyone and welcome to Snippit Sports Science Podcast. This is Jared Coleman-Starr, today with Chris Gaviglio. How are you, Chris?
Yep, good, thanks, Jared.
So we have another requested article today, so another big shout out to Will. Will also requested the sex article that was extremely popular, so we think perhaps this one will be popular as well. Today's article is The Multiple Roles of Steroids and Anabolic Steroids and its Relations to Cardiovascular and Musculoskeletal Pathology. A brief review.
So before we get into this article, I think perhaps on behalf of Jared and I, we don't condone the use of anabolic steroids or any banned substances for that fact.
Right, or anything that could negatively affect health, we can't condone as well. There's plenty of things, like plastic consumption. Can't condone that. I cannot condone people drinking water out of those disposable plastic bottles.
I thought you meant consuming plastic.
Well, you are. So when you drink out of those little plastic bottles, and this is a thing about steroids, everyone. All right, you consume steroids every single day. Everyone consumes estrogen all the time because our plastic products actually leach estrogens into our consumption. And we inhale estrogens, we drink estrogens in our water. So there's estrogens. There's estrogen-like compounds in the plastics. And so when you use your disposable plastic bottles and you put water into them, particularly if you reuse them or you put them out into the sun, some of that plastic, little bits of it, that weird taste that the water has if you drink like a plastic water bottle that's been out in the sun. That weird taste is the plastics that leach out of it and into the water that you put into your body. And some of those chemicals are estrogens, xenoestrogens, external estrogens. And that's why we see a lot of environmental effects like frogs changing gender because plastic estrogen waste has been dumped into the rivers near where they live.
You're a plethora of amazing information.
I just know a bunch of random stuff.
I think it's important not to be naive and understand, the roles, what's the side effects associated with it. I still think it's an education point of view that we shouldn't hide our heads in the sand, but rather, from our point of view, I'm more than happy to help, highlight this information and actually get it out there so people are actually aware of the facts. And I think that's it. Like there's fallacies and there's facts, and it's important to be able to distinguish between the two.
Right, and there are differences in types of steroids. So I think there's, unfortunately, a lot of ignorance around what is a steroid. And a steroid is simply a signaling molecule. It's a hormone. And so when we say steroids, most people think of anabolic steroids, like testosterone or something like growth hormone, and they don't consider that there are other steroids like glucocorticosteroids, which, as well as in some cases with anabolic steroids, do have legitimate therapeutic medical uses. People with autoimmune disorders do need exposure to or benefit from exposure in a controlled medical environment to glucocorticosteroids because they need their immune systems partially suppressed. Talking about steroids a bit more, they constitute a special category of compounds which are abundant to all organisms, ranging from lower species in the evolutionary chain to higher mammals, including humans. A special subcategory of the steroids determine sex in organisms and are produced by the gonads in humans. Naturally occurring steroids and synthetic steroids are utilized for treatment purposes or as anabolics. Flashing back to the history of anabolics, it's worth mentioning that the action of steroids as artificial strengtheners is known since the early 1930s. At that time, testosterone was found to be the hormone that attributes the sex characteristics to males and participates in sexual maturation of juveniles. Further on, tests of steroids as medication alternatives were reported back in the late 1930s.
Today, the use of steroid anabolics is restricted to therapeutic methods only, and the supplement use for sporting purposes is prohibited. If we look at statistical data from the United States of America, some really important facts here. Until 1989, 11% of teenagers had stated steroid use, of whom 65% were tempted by performance-enhancing reasons, and the other 35% by cosmetic reasons. The percentage of 11% increased in the late 1990s, approaching to that of 20%.
20% in the late 1990s. That's 1 out of 5 people were using anabolics. That's incredible. I reckon you hear someone has used steroids in the 1990s, and that's a societal problem. That's not a individual problem. You almost can't fault an individual for the use of something that 20% of that society is doing. There's a lot of societal pressure to be doing that.
When we look at the intake of anabolic steroids, as Jared said earlier, it can be separated into two main categories. The first is pharmaceutical, so as used as a medication, and the second is that anabolic use. So anabolic steroids have to utilize two pathways of action. First of all, they stimulate protein synthesis, and second, they are antagonists of the naturally occurring steroids, cortisol. And as we speak about earlier, is the relationship between testosterone and cortisol naturally in humans. Therefore, they promote cell proliferation and growth, and in particular muscle tissue and bone. It's been reported that they function as antagonists of another category of steroids, the glucocorticoids, which participate in exactly the opposite mechanism. We know that testosterone is that anabolic hormone, whereas the cortisol is that catabolic hormone, the opposite of each other. So they're factors of response to stress factors in such a way that they induce muscle tissue catabolism and bone as well.
Now, what we really care about a lot in this article are the uses and side effects of the anabolic steroids. Well, we see that anabolic steroids are used for therapeutic reasons and secondarily for cosmetic reasons. There's both. So a lot of people need them for therapeutic reasons. As you age, your testosterone decreases or you may have a disorder. But then, of course, people also do want to look big and strong. In cases where anabolics are given in the framework of treatment, they have minor side effects because they substitute a missing or dysfunctional area of the homeostasis of the body. It's not the same thing as when someone already has normal physiological testosterone and they supplement with additional anabolics. On the other hand, there is a big debate on the side effects of steroids when used for cosmetic reasons. Their use does not discriminate between the sexes, since it appears that both sexes use steroids, and, in cases, extensively. The main reason is the improvement of athletic performance and endurance. In males, long-term use of anabolics causes oligospermy, gynecomastia, and impotency. At the same time, as aforementioned, it is considered to be a risk factor for hepatic cancer. In females, it appears that it manifests exactly the opposite effects. In other words, it induces the appearance of masculine characteristics such as deepening voice, increase of hair in the areas controlled by androgen receptors, such as the area around the genitalia and face.
With respect to the cardiovascular system, it's been reported that side effects are dose-dependent and probably time-dependent as well. That means the larger the doses and the longer the time interval administered, the more intense the effects on the cardiovascular system are. Unfortunately, these side effects do not discriminate between pharmacological and cosmetic uses.
Although, from that previous note that we made, it does depend on the absolute level. If someone is already deficient in the androgens and they bring those androgens back up to a normal physiological range, it's a completely different situation as when someone is at 1,000-fold physiological level of androgens.
Yeah, that's a good point. In respect to the effects, they can basically be divided into two categories of direct and indirect side effects. The indirect side effects appears when the influence in the cardiovascular system is on secondary physiological mechanisms such as blood pressure, which increases due to the use of anabolic steroids. In addition, it has been reported that the use of anabolics increases the levels of low-density lipoproteins and decreases those of high-density lipoproteins, which develop as a secondary side effect. The increase of blood pressure and the apparition of cardiac dysfunction due to the effect of atherosclerosis.
So we're seeing potential negative effects on lipoproteins, blood lipids, blood pressure, cardiac dysfunction, atherosclerosis. There sounds like there's potentially quite a few negative effects on the cardiovascular system from anabolic use. Now, we'd like to move into a couple of examples of special populations. So, for example, in a case study performed on 2,400 transsexuals who've gone through a laborious sex change operation from female to male and subsequently treated with testosterone for long periods of time, saw no significant increase in cardiovascular diseases compared to general population. Another special population case is this wasn't exactly an experiment, but there was a cultural phenomenon that from about 1500 to 1900, there were a lot of castrations aiming at the maintenance and probably quality of the voice for the highest octaves for artistic and like church singing sort of purposes, which they called the castrati. In other words, individuals who'd gone through the process of castration were forced into a life literally without any production of androgens. So there's been a particular study that looked at the lifespans of these individuals who were castrated and found that there was no significant difference compared to general population. The castrati had an average lifespan of 66 years, and the rest of the population had a lifespan of 64. And so if we're taking into account the contribution of steroids to the overall survival of a population, it would be likely that males with sufficient and constant production of testosterone would have a lower life expectancy as to the castrati, since the existence of testosterone renders males more vulnerable to cardiovascular diseases. However, we're seeing in both these cases where people who've gone through a female-to-male sex change and men who were castrated and thus had no androgen production, both had no differences in their cardiovascular health. Now, despite the numerous controversies concerning the use of anabolic steroids, their presence still abides therein, especially in sports. Hence, so far, there is no concise opinion formed on the effects of anabolic steroids in the cardiovascular system. However, an opposing view has been reported where defects in testosterone production can cause LDL increase and HDL decrease, and consequently atherosclerosis.
So it really seems here that it directly doesn't cause issues with the cardiovascular system, but there are effects that it potentially can form as a result.
That's my understanding.
A little bit further on that, so the extensive use of anabolics by heavy weightlifters could potentially lead to changes in the morphology of the cardiac muscle. So for instance, the expansion of the left ventricle and the thickening of the cardiac musculature. Yet the etiology has been attributed to the overuse of anabolics, since they reach 1,000 doses higher than those of pharmacological use. So in one of these studies, the use of anabolics that they reported are presented to be culpable for ischemic myocardium and combined with increased lipidemic profile. Although this has been shown to be reversible, it can triple the risk of cardiovascular disease.
Wow, that's incredible. But that is such an extreme use, 1,000 doses, and taking into account that it's reversible. So the 1,000 times dose, and hopefully, I mean, at least if someone is using anabolics, I hope that they're not using a 1,000-fold dose and they're not doing it for their entire life, resulting in irreversible effects.
Well, this is a poor analogy, but you hear about any type of exercise regime, and when someone gets injured or something traumatic happens, it's traditionally when they're doing something that isn't of a safe protocol.
Oh, absolutely.
And not trying to condone, obviously, steroid use here.
Right.
But I think there's a really good information to put out there for people in the public.
Right. Well, it reminds me of part of the discussion that we were having just before starting the podcast around, is rehabilitation, physiotherapeutic rehabilitation, is that therapeutic?
Yeah, that was a good point. And I think in respect to Gen Pop, does this have a place to improve recovery from traumatic injury and improve quality of life with done within correct therapeutic doses?
Right.
So just food for thought there.
I mean, I believe very much in the spirit of sport. I think certainly if someone is competing in organized sport, that they shouldn't be taking any sort of banned substance whatsoever, just across the board easily. But if someone is, if you have an elderly man who's not participating in organized sport and he's just broken a hip, I could see it very easily as being beneficial for his life and for society, is if he was on agents that we know to improve those quality of life factors.
And that's where I think a lot of these longevity type doctors who, quite proliferant, you see on TV in the US and so forth, potentially can get their market from. And I think, just as in conclusion, when you look at this, people see those short-term effects and they don't really look into the long-term effects of how it may negatively affect them later in life. And I think that's the big thing here to take into consideration for anyone out there that, we're not going to stop people doing this type of intake of, we're not going to stop people taking steroids, but I think it's important to understand the potential ramifications later on down the life.
Absolutely. We can't infringe on anyone's personal liberty. I think personal liberty does come, free choice does come before making good decisions. You need to have the ability to make those decisions before you can make good ones. So we can't in any way try to infringe on anyone's personal liberty, but we can encourage them towards good action.
Yeah. Well, I think that's where we're going to leave it there today, Jared. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Chris.
And thanks, listeners, as well. Remember our socials at Snippit Science, and also you can listen to our podcast at our website at snippetscience.com. Remember to leave a rating on iTunes. Thanks to Elite Form. Tune in next week.